It's late October 1943. Irena, a courageous young woman, has spent years risking her life, but today her time has run out. The Gestapo are pounding violently on the door, and Irena knows they've come for her and the incriminating evidence she's been hiding. If the Gestapo find the small glass jar, it's not just Irena's life at risk, but thousands of others. The fate of the entire underground resistance hangs in the balance. Hey y'all, I'm Christina and you're listening to History and Hearsay. Irena Sendler was born on February 15th, 1910. So just a quick little side note, her name can be pronounced as Irena or Irena, basically the difference in the Polish and English pronunciations. So I apologize if I switch back and forth between those two during this video. And lived in Otwock, Poland with her devout Catholic parents. Dr. Stanisław Krzyżanowska, who was a physician, and his wife, Janina. Irena was an only child and grew up in a predominantly Jewish town where her father treated poor patients whom other doctors in the area refused to help. In February of 1917, Dr. Krzyżanowska died from typhus that he contracted while treating patients. After his death, Jewish community leaders offered Irena's mother help in paying for her education. And because of this financial assistance, Irena was able to attend Warsaw University and studied Polish literature. While in university, Irena was furious at the constant discrimination against her Jewish friends. She had been raised to see people as equal in value, and she opposed the ghetto bench system that existed at some Polish universities. This system was basically segregation. It forced the Jewish students to sit in certain sections in their classes, and this was enforced under the threat of expulsion. So as a grad student in social welfare, Irena denounced the segregation of the classrooms, and she defaced her non-Jewish identity card. The result of her public protest earned her a reputation of being a troublemaker, and she was suspended from the University of Warsaw for 3 years. Irena's great-grandfather had led a rebellion against the Tsars, so it sounds like resistance and standing up for what she believed in was kind of in Irena's blood. She once wrote, "I was raised to believe that the question of religion, nationality, belonging to any race is of no importance. It's a human being that matters." In 1931, Irena married Miroslav Sendler, and the couple moved to Warsaw. In Warsaw, Irena put her degree to use and became a social worker, overseeing the city's canteens, which provided assistance like food and medicine to people in need. In September of 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland, they brought with them new laws that further eroded Jewish rights. 29-year-old Irena and her colleagues took advantage of their positions working in the canteen to provide medicine, clothing, and other necessities to the city's persecuted Jewish population. One of the injustices that the Jewish people had to deal with is that whatever rations were allowed, the Jewish people always were allotted less than their Polish counterparts, who were considered Aryan by the Nazis. And at this point, Irena and her colleagues started taking advantage of their positions even more in order to help Jews by offering them food and shelter. Irena was pretty high up in the social department and had the ability to create official documents, so she and her colleagues would falsify records for Jewish people in order to give them more assistance than what was legally allowed. Irena and her helpers made over 3,000 false documents to help Jewish families, and they were also helping their Jewish friends to go into hiding during this time. And then in 1940, Hitler announced that Jews in Warsaw were to be forced into an area that was only about 1 square mile, and this area would become known as the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, in today's society, when you hear the term ghetto, you might think of a really poor and maybe unsafe area of town, but this term actually dates back to Venice, Italy in the 1500s. 1516 to be exact, when any Jews who were living in the city of Venice were segregated from the rest of the population and forced to reside in a certain area called Ghetto Venezia, which became Europe's first ghetto. Now, of course, if you have studied World War II history at all, then you're very familiar with these ghettos and this forced segregation that started being set up by the Nazis all over Europe. as Jewish families were removed from their homes and businesses and forced to live in some pretty terrible conditions. Once the Warsaw Ghetto was erected, Irena could no longer help isolated Jews as they were all forced into this small ghetto that was roughly the size of New York's Central Park, and 450,000 Jewish people were forced to live in this area. It was bordered by high walls and subject to constant surveillance. As you can imagine, this overcrowding caused all types of issues. Homes that had previously held 3 people now held up to 25. And being in such close quarters with no place to go, disease spread rapidly in the Warsaw Ghetto. Each time that rationing got worse in Poland, it was even worse for the Jewish population. By the time that the people of Poland were cut down to 700 calories per day, the Jews were allowed only 184 calories per day. Thousands died every single month from disease and starvation. So at this point, Irena's credentials, being an employee of the social welfare department for the city of Warsaw, are no longer enough to get her where she needs to go. And so she gets a forged pass that says she's a sanitation nurse. And she's coming into the ghetto to check for signs of typhus. And so she's able to get a permit that allows her to go in and out of the ghetto every single day, sometimes 2 or 3 times per day, to be able to bring in supplies. In 1942, 280,000 Jews were deported from Warsaw to the death camp in Treblinka. This camp was in a forest northeast of Warsaw and was the second deadliest extermination camp to be built and operated by Nazi Germany in occupied Poland during World War II. This camp was in operation for less than a year and a half, and it's estimated that in that time, somewhere between 700,000 and 900,000 Jews and 2,000 Romani people were murdered at this camp. In response to mass deportation to the death camp in the fall of 1942, the Council for Aid to Jews, or Zegota as it was codenamed, was established, and Irena became one of its main activists. This group included sympathetic Polish officials, underground medical professionals, and concerned citizens. Zegota played a critical role in the rescue of a large number of Jews who had survived the mass deportations. The organization took care of thousands of Jews who were trying to survive in hiding, seeking hiding places, and paying for their upkeep and medical care. Inside the ghetto, they were mainly working to smuggle supplies in, but as more and more Jews were being deported to Treblinka and rumors swirled about where all these people were being sent, desperate parents began to send their children to hide in sewers or even try to get them over the walls to safety. By the end of 1942, these mass deportations to Treblinka meant that most of the Jews of Warsaw had been killed. Irena and the other members of her network started to think that maybe they could save some of these children if they were able to smuggle them out of the ghetto. Irena's underground code name was Jolanta, and she is appointed director of Zegota's Department for the Care of Jewish Children, and at great personal risk, Irena and her associates began smuggling children out of the ghetto. She exploited the contacts she had at orphanages and institutes for abandoned children in order to send Jewish children there. We know for sure that there were at least 10 other people helping Irena with physically smuggling the children out. There were 1 male and 9 female social workers, but Irena's social network overall had to have been pretty massive to pull this off. Many of the children were sent to the Family of Mary Orphanage in Warsaw and to religious institutions run by nuns in nearby cities. So at first, they started by just smuggling out orphan children. They were pretty easy to pick up off the street because there was no one to miss them. But over time, Irena just couldn't turn a blind eye to the fact that there were a lot of other children in the ghetto who still had parents, but were also in grave danger. Of course, she would need their parents' permission to get these children out. And how could you ask a parent to give up their child? But something that her father used to say to her when she was a little girl just started to run on repeat in her mind. And that was, if you see a man drowning, you must save him, even if you cannot swim. Irena just couldn't shake the feeling that she must save as many children as she possibly could. So she starts going door to door, disguised as a nurse who's checking for disease, and instead, she's really there asking mothers to give her their babies. She's telling parents and grandparents, I would like to take your children and put them in a safe place until the war is over. She explained that she would keep their information and her goal would be to reunite the families after the war. And the mothers would say to Irena, give us a guarantee. And she'd say, I can't guarantee you anything. I can't even guarantee you that we will get out of the ghetto alive. If the Nazi officers catch me trying to take a Jewish child out, they will shoot us both, no questions asked. All she could promise them was that she would do her best. And these mothers had to make the gut-wrenching choice of letting their child go off with a stranger because they knew that their children stood a better chance with her than in the ghetto with them. Some mothers surrendered infants, and the way that they would get them out without having these babies cry is that they would lightly sedate them. Then they would put them in bags with holes so they could breathe, and they would lay them between the legs of corpses that were in coffins being taken out of the ghetto. It sounds like taking children out with dead bodies was one of the best ways they could do this and not be caught, because the soldiers typically seemed to steer clear of the dead bodies because they were afraid they might catch something. And if a child could pretend to be sick or was actually very ill, then they could also legally remove these children via ambulance. And sometimes they would hide children who weren't sick under stretchers in ambulances to get them out. Some children were smuggled out by trolley, hiding in a sack or a trunk, a suitcase, or something similar. One of Irena's collaborators would drive a tram car through the ghetto, and the last stop before going back to the Aryan side, another collaborator would put a sedated child who might be in a box or something similar and place the box under the seat in the tram. If the Gestapo had ever found a box with a baby or a young child in it, the tram driver would certainly have been shot. These people were so brave, and luckily, they were never caught. Once the driver got to the other side of the ghetto, they would take the child off the tram on the Aryan side and place them with a Polish family who would act as a safe house until the children could be moved again. Irena once said that she could never use the exact same method twice because it was just too dangerous. It sounds like some of their methods were similar at times, but they would change something up about it every single time in order to avoid detection. So of course, this meant they had to get really creative in finding new ways and methods to get these kids out. Irena did use a dog on occasion who was trained to bark if it saw any Nazis coming, but she didn't do this very often because of the need to switch things up. Some children were bundled up with dirty laundry and taken out in potato sacks or even placed in toolboxes or briefcases. Some children were snuck out through sewer pipes or other secret underground tunnels. There was a Catholic church that the line where the ghetto was went straight through the church. One entrance of this church was on the ghetto side and the other was on the Aryan side. And so one of the ways that they would take older or larger children out is that they would take them into this church and they would teach them Polish prayers and things like how to cross themselves. You know how Catholics will make the sign of the cross? Well, they taught the children how to do this. And so the entrance to the church was sealed by the Germans. And so there was a chance that, of course, they could be stopped by a German soldier or policeman. And if the child could speak good Polish and rattle off some Christian prayers, there was a much higher chance that they could get away. They would sometimes dress the little boys as girls, and they would dye the little girls' hair from brown to blonde. Just anything they could do to disguise them and make them look that they were Aryan. Of course, once they got the child out of the church, a collaborator would meet them and take the child to a safe house. There was also a courthouse that was the same way. The ghetto line went straight through it. And so same thing with the courthouse. They would walk the child through on the ghetto line and pass right through to safety. Once a child was in one of the safe houses, Irena would forge Aryan identity papers for them before sending them on to the orphanage, a convent, or foster families across Poland. Irena and her network always made it very clear to each family that was hiding a child that the child must be returned to Jewish relatives after the war. It was very important to Irena that the children retained their Jewish identities, but it would be very dangerous if this information was ever to get in the hands of the wrong person. And so in order to keep track of each child, Irena kept records on thin cigarette paper and stored them in glass jars. On these papers, she wrote the child's information in a code, and this included the child's real Jewish name, their Jewish parents' names, the child's new Christian name, where they were placed, and their age. Once a jar was full of names, Irena would bury the jar underground so that it could be dug up after the war. Her ultimate goal was to reunite families after the war, but if not, at the very least, she hoped that she would be able to help these children retain a sense of identity. She wanted them to know that they were Jewish. And this list of names had reached roughly 2,500 by the time the Gestapo came knocking. From July 22nd until September 12, 1942, German SS and police units, assisted by auxiliaries, carried out mass deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto to the Treblinka death camp. During what was described as the Great Actions, the Germans deported about 265,000 Jews from Warsaw to Treblinka. They killed approximately 35,000 Jews inside the ghetto during this operation. By early 1943, the surviving Jews in the ghettos numbered approximately 70 to 80,000 individuals. In April of 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising took place, and this was a pivotal action of Jewish resistance during the Holocaust. As the Nazis intensified their efforts to deport the remaining Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto to extermination camps, the Jewish inhabitants, largely unarmed and living in dire conditions, organized a coordinated revolt. Led by groups such as the Jewish Combat Organization, ZOB, and the Jewish Military Union, ZZW, the resistance fighters relied on small arms, homemade explosives, and their knowledge of the ghetto's layout to launch attacks across the heavily armed German troops. Despite being vastly outnumbered and outgunned, the insurgents managed to inflict significant casualties on the Nazis and prolonged the fight for nearly a month. The uprising was marked by acts of bravery and solidarity among the Jewish fighters who created bunkers and established communication networks to coordinate their efforts. The Nazis responded with brutal force, employing artillery and burning of buildings to crush the rebellion. Although the uprising ultimately failed, resulting in the destruction of the ghetto and the deaths of many fighters and civilians, it became a powerful symbol of resistance against tyranny. So as all of this is going on, Irena and her group tried to work faster. Zegota helped expand this operation more quickly by stashing money for Irena in post boxes across Warsaw. But unfortunately, this system would lead to Irena's downfall when the Gestapo discovered a laundry owner's business that contained a Zegota post box. The woman was unable to withstand the torture, and she gave the police Irena's name. On October 20th, 1943, the Gestapo burst into Irena's apartment and arrested her for aiding Jews throughout the country. When Irena was arrested, she felt almost liberated. She had been working in secret for so long. The Gestapo placed her in the notorious Piawiak prison, where she was questioned and relentlessly tortured. The German who interrogated her was young, very stylish, and spoke perfect Polish. He wanted the names of the Zegota leaders, their addresses, and the names of others involved. The only thing standing between the Gestapo and thousands of innocent children now living as Aryan was Irena. Despite months of physical and psychological torture in which both of her legs and her feet were broken, Irena never revealed any information to the Nazis. During one of her interrogations, the German soldier held up a folder with information of places, times, and persons who had informed on her. But Irena refused to comply, and defiant to the very end, she was sentenced to execution by firing squad. on January 20th, 1944. As incredible as Irena's story was, she may have gone mostly unrecognized if it had not been for a high school project in 1999. High school teacher Norm Conrad was pretty well known in Uniontown, Kansas for his National History Day competitions. Every year he challenged his students to find an unknown hero to report on. So students would break off into groups of 3 or 4 and would work on the project together, and then they would compete against the other groups in the school with a final presentation that might include like a skit or some type of play or something like that. This was a mostly independent research project with the teacher simply facilitating. One of the groups, which was comprised of 4 girls, Megan, Liz, Sabrina, and Jessica, knew they wanted to do their project on someone from the Holocaust, but they were a little lost on exactly where to start. So they asked Mr. Conrad if he had any ideas, and he gave them this box that was full of newspaper and magazine clippings, and he tells them that there might be something in this box that they would be interested in. So the girls start digging through this box, and one of them finds a clipping from a 1994 issue of U.S. News and World Report. The headline on this clipping was titled Other Schindlers, and it had a list of various women and a paragraph about each one, and one of them was Irena Sendler. It was just a short little mention of how she had saved 2,500 kids from the Warsaw Ghetto. The girls were so shocked to see this, and so they bring this paper back to their teacher thinking surely this must be a typo. Schindler had saved around 1,500 people and was basically a household name. There was no possible way that this woman could have saved 2,500 kids, and we've never even heard her name before. And so they're thinking maybe there was 250 people. I mean, that would still be incredible, but 2,500 just felt mind-boggling. So Mr. Conrad agrees with the girls that this story does seem a little wild, and he encourages them to continue to dig for more information. They do an internet search, and they're only able to find one website on the internet that has any mention of Irena at all. Of course, this was in 1999, and the internet wasn't as vast as it is now, but the website they found was for the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous. And this article confirmed what the magazine had printed, that Irena had saved 2,500 children. But even this website didn't have much more than a little paragraph about her, and so the girls started to dig more, going to libraries and looking in various other places. They knew that Irena had to be about 90 years old, and so they weren't expecting that she would still be alive even if she had survived the war. And they started thinking, well, maybe we can find some information on where she's buried and like her tombstone, her grave, and all of that. And so eventually the girls decide to send an email to the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous. They explain what they're doing, and they ask if there's any additional information that they could send the girls about Irena. Maybe they have some information on where she's buried. And so the girls get an email back from the foundation, and it says that Irena is still alive and living in Warsaw. January 1944. Irena has just been sentenced to death. She's walking to meet her executioner when suddenly a German officer diverts her course. Unbeknownst to her, underground activists have been working to save Irena. Zegota bribed the Gestapo with the equivalent of more than $100,000 in today's money to release Irena. That night, from her room, Irena hears the bullhorns as her death is loudly proclaimed for all to hear. The next day, she walks past posters that have been put up all over the city with the news that Irena Sendler has been shot for her crimes against the Reich. Of course, Irena and the work she was doing was very important to their cause, but Zegota also knew that if they allowed Irena to be put to death, the identities of 2,500 Jewish children would be lost forever.
No i w 1943 roku, w październiku, w dniu akurat moich imienin, przyszło po mnie Gestapo. Oczywiście zostałam zaaresztowana. Ta pani, która mnie wydała, nie wytrzymała bicia, wydała moje nazwisko, więc oczywiście Niemcy wiedzieli, że ja jestem w jakiejś organizacji, która pomaga Żydom. Bili, torturowali, stąd moje chore nogi i bardzo krótko dostałam wyrok śmierci. Gry psy szły, liściki konspiracyjne między Zegotą a mną na Pawiaku. Zegota robiła wszystko, żeby mnie wydostać. Nie tylko przez sympatię do mnie, ale ja miałam, jedyna osoba, która miałam zaszyfrowane 2,5 tysiąca dzieci żydowskich umieszczonych w rozmaitych miejscach, w klasztorach, u osób prywatnych. I ta kartoteka była u mnie w domu. Dzięki wielkiemu przypadkowi ona się do rąk niemieckich nie dostała. Więc Zegota wiedziała, że jeżeli ja zostanę zabita, to 2,5 tysiąca dzieci żydowskich nigdy nie trafi do społeczności żydowskiej, dlatego że tej kartoteki nikt nie wiedział, gdzie ona jest zaszyfrowana. Kartoteka to znaczy wąskie paseczki papieru, gdzie było napisane, że powiedzmy Marysia Kowalska to się równa Racheli Rosenberg, ukryty powiedzmy w klasztorze sióstr takich i takich, prawda? Więc osoba moja była osobą, którą zależało, żebym ja żyła. Wobec tego Zegota robiła wszystko grobelnie, żeby mnie z tego Pawiaka wydostać.
Her close encounter with death did not deter her, and after her release in February 1944, Irena assumed a new identity and continued her work for Zegota. But the authorities were now keeping a very close eye on her, and she had to continue overseeing Zegota rescue missions from hiding. The dangers were so great that she was even unable to attend her own mother's funeral. During the remaining years of the war, Irena lived hidden, just like the children she had rescued. And she remained the only one who knew where the children were to be found until the war was finally over, when she dug up the jars that had been hidden right under the Nazis' noses, across the street from the German barracks under an apple tree. She then began the job of finding the children and trying to find a living parent. Unfortunately, almost all of the parents of the children Irena saved had died in the ghetto or at the Treblinka death camp. Irena remained in contact with many of the children that she and her collaborators had rescued for the rest of her life. Irena's first marriage ended in divorce, and in 1947, she remarried and had 3 children. After Irena became a mother, she said it was a good thing that she had done her work in the ghetto prior to becoming a mother, because had she known what it was like to be a mother back then, she may not have had the heart to ask mothers to give up their children. After World War II, Poland became a communist satellite state of the Soviet Union known as the Polish People's Republic. Poland's leaders were basically ordered around like low-level employees, and because of this political climate, this is why people like Irena were not very well known even in their own country. In 1965, Irena's work received its first public acknowledgement when Israel's Holocaust Memorial Organization named her as righteous among the nations for her work in saving Jewish children. The tree planted in her honor stands at the entrance to the Avenue of the Righteous Among the Nations. So the high school girls from Uniontown, Kansas, while still trying to find out more about Irena, had started to write a play for their final project. And when they got the shocking news that Irena was still alive and they were sent her address, they wrote her a letter telling her all about their school project. They include pictures of themselves, a copy of the script for the play they were writing about her life, and they sent her money for postage to write them back. So they get a letter back from Irena, and they, of course, have to get it translated to English. But Irena writes back, and she's very warm and gracious, and she's so happy to hear from the girls. And she told the girls all about how she was able to get children out of the ghetto and place them in homes. She told them about putting the children's names on slips of paper in the glass jars. And this is why they ended up naming their project and their play Life in a Jar. And in that first letter, Irena also sent a receipt of where she had donated the money the girls had sent her to a boys' home. The girls continued to write letters back and forth with Irena, and this is how we know all of the details that I talked about earlier in this video. So during all of this time that they are writing back and forth with Irena, the girls start performing their play, and at one of the performances, a Jewish businessman who was in the crowd asked to take the girls and their teachers out to lunch so that they could talk. He asked them what else they were hoping to accomplish with their play, and they told him that they had gotten really close to Irena. She was the girls' hero now, and that they were really hoping to raise enough money to take a trip to Poland to go and meet her. So he asked them what they were doing to raise money and how much they had raised, and they said they were selling candy bars and they had raised $81, which they said they kind of all had a chuckle about. But then he told them, let me make a few phone calls and get back with you guys and see what I can do to help out. I don't think the group really expected much from this, but within 24 hours, he had called their teacher back and said, I've raised the money, you guys can go to Poland. So in 2001, the girls, some of the girls' parents and grandparents, and Mr. Conrad and his wife all went to Poland. They said when they walked into Irena's apartment, she knew each and every one of them by name and went to them, said their name, and gave them a big hug. In the years following, as the girls traveled around to various schools and Jewish synagogues performing their play, internet search results for Irena went from 1 to over 750,000 websites telling Irena's story. As Irena's story became known to the world through the Life in the Jar project, she was awarded various awards from 2003 to 2008 for her heroic actions. In 2007, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and in 2008, she was given an honorary citizenship of Israel. In one of Irena's letters to the girls, she wrote, my emotions is being shadowed by the fact that no one from the circle of my faithful coworkers who constantly risked their lives could live long enough to enjoy all the honors that now are falling upon me. I can't find the words to thank you, my dear girls. Before the day you have written the play, Life in a Jar, nobody in my own country and in the whole world cared about my person and my work during the war. Some sources only credit Irena with saving a few hundred children, but the students of the Life in a Jar project have gathered over 4,000 pages of primary material and research on the life of Irena Sendler and the work of Zegota, and they are confident in the accuracy that the number of children saved is 2,500 as was originally reported. Irena was so humble. She didn't feel worthy of all of the praise that she got. And she told the girls that she had nightmares every night of her life, worried that she didn't do enough. The girls were able to make several trips back and forth to Poland, and their last visit to see Irena was 9 days before her death in May of 2008. She was 98 years old. There have now been multiple books and even a movie written about her work in the Warsaw Ghetto. Poland suffered greatly during World War II, and all these years later, many are understandably still very sensitive to depictions of their country during this time. In 2016, there was a politician in Poland who was trying to make it illegal to refer to the World War II concentration camps in Poland as death camps. This seemed to be an attempt to put a stop to conversations that implied any Polish culpability for Nazi crimes during the war. But sadly, the truth is some Poles helped Nazis to identify and hunt down their Jewish neighbors and those who tried to assist Jews, either to save their own skin or because they had hatreds in their own heart. But while this wartime history is complex, many Poles stood up against tyranny and saved thousands of lives. Just in Irena's network alone, there were so many who passed away before they could ever be acknowledged. I can only imagine how many different people had to have been involved with saving 2,500 children. I mean, just think about the amount of homes there had to have been for them to be placed in. As of 2022, there were 7,232 officially recognized Polish righteous, the highest count of any nation in the world. And there were many more who, like Irena, put their lives on the line to save their neighbors. These are the righteous, whose names we may never know. So I have another book recommendation for you guys. This is Life in a Jar by Jack Mayer. This is the story of the girls from Kansas and Irena directly from the source. So check it out if you're interested, and I'll catch you right here in the next one.